Hello, this is Jonathan of Steel Bear Academy. This is going to be part 2 of my multi-part series about how to persuade someone to go from being anti-gun to pro-gun. This is going to be part 2. This is Pathos. So we talked briefly about what Pathos was, but we'll cover it again. So we covered ethos in the first one. That's your credibility as the speaker. Pathos is all about appealing to your audience's emotions. So making an emotional appeal. What does that mean exactly? So an emotional appeal is where you are trying to drive your audience to do something because of their emotions, because of their reactions to their emotions. Typically it's when you're trying to help. Typically what is going on in them is, for example, let's say you say, I think probably the most classic example of this is those dog commercials where they're trying to get you to donate to helping animal shelters, and they got those poor little sad puppies and poor sad kitties, and they got the sad music playing. They are appealing to your emotion of wanting to avoid those animals being in pain or those animals being sad. They're trying to tap into your compassion. It is very natural to feel compassion. Just about everybody feels compassion. And compassion is just, if I was going to describe it, it's how you are able to understand the pain of somebody else and to be able to wish that it wasn't there, let's say. You're able to understand that it hurts somebody else to feel pain, and you don't want them to feel pain because you don't like pain yourself, and you prefer the world to not have pain. So pathos is an appeal to the emotions. You're trying to make the other person motivated to do something to avoid a bad feeling. As a person, you typically don't want to feel bad feelings. You don't want to feel pity. You don't want to feel like compassion that makes you feel guilty. You don't want to feel guilty. So an appeal to emotion would be to try to make the audience feel like, I want to avoid having to feel guilty, so I'm going to do something to make myself not feel guilty. That's a classic emotional appeal. Something I want to clarify, when we're talking about emotional appeals, it is very, very common for the anti-gun lot, the people who want to ban guns, to use the emotional appeal extensively. Compassion is a very powerful motivator. When people see other people suffering, they want to do something about it generally. It makes them uncomfortable to know that somebody else is suffering while they are not, or it makes them uncomfortable to know that there is suffering in the world and they are told that they could have done something about it. That makes you feel guilty. So the anti-gun lot is very, very good at doing that. But the pro-gun lot, the pro-gun people are typically, they kind of lack in that regard. They don't utilize what they have as well as they could, because most people who are pro-gun tend to be more on the logical side of the spectrum. They tend to be men. Most gun lovers, let's say pro-gun people, are probably men. At least like 60 to 70% of them, I'd say. Very, very predominantly male. And men tend to prefer the logical side of arguments. Not to say that they can't understand the emotional side, but men, I think, as a general rule, tend to more easily use logic as their basis for doing something and not so much the pathos. Now, because we are, let's say I'm pro-gun and we're trying to convince people who are anti-gun, you're going to have to come and meet them at this same playing field. If you're going to persuade somebody, you need all three. You need pathos, ethos, and logos in order to persuade somebody. Not necessarily all in equal proportion, let's say, but you do need pathos, because pathos is what drives us to make a change. If we don't feel something, we're not going to do anything about it. So even if you had the best logic, and even if you are somebody who people trust, if they don't care, meaning they don't feel something, people probably still won't change their mind. They won't do anything about it because you didn't use the right ratio. You need some pathos. So let's start off by talking about compassion. In order for you to combat that anti-gun, compassion-based arguments, you need to understand how compassion works, and you need to understand how to fight against the basic notion that compassion, if you feel compassion for something, that means that it is automatically the right choice. If somebody tells you something like, well, you just don't care about the children, or you don't care about whatever, you don't care about the 100,000 deaths a year due to gun violence. We'll talk about the statistic in the next video, but gun deaths is usually how they refer to it. So if you're going to combat somebody, if you're going to address their concerns, whether it's debating or persuading just a person, you need to understand how to come at compassion. You need to understand how it works, how you can use it, how you can get somebody around it, and you need to understand how to take it back for you as a persuader. Something here is I want to talk about something briefly. Compassion is not the same as morality. So it is natural to react to something with compassion. However, just because you feel something naturally does not mean that it is moral to follow through on doing that thing. So let's say, for example, if you feel, and this is going to get into some pretty tricky territory for the whole ethos part, but you got to be careful when you make these arguments. But if you're going to say that somebody's suffering, you shouldn't immediately go and try to solve the scenario with something that immediately alleviates that suffering. You need to understand why somebody is naturally drawn to feeding it with something. So there's a popular logical fallacy of the politicians. If this bad thing is happening when we have to do something about it, so let's say poverty, for example. Let's say there's poverty, which there is. Poverty is bad. We have to do things to stop things that are bad. This solution over here we came up with is something. Therefore, we must do it. This is not true. Just because this thing is something doesn't mean that you have to use this to solve poverty. It may not fix it, and it may do damage. However, if you're of the mindset that I have to alleviate this problem over here, there's suffering over here, and I have to alleviate it, and somebody presents you an option, it's going to be very tempting for them to just say, that's an option, we'll do that, put it in there, get it done. Now, that is a natural response. However, we don't make decisions based simply on what is natural. That's not how our laws work. That's not how anything works. That's not a foundation for behavior. People have lots of natural inclinations. You might feel angry. If you feel angry and you want to kill somebody, that might be a natural inclination, but that's not how we build our system of morality. So just because something might fix something does not mean that we should immediately do it. We have to evaluate it. We have to make sure that it is something that is going to match up with all of our wants and desires. So this is getting back to the guns. In order for you to combat anti-gun sentiment, you're going to have to come up with ways to combat that compassion in ways that are easily digestible and are ways in which people who heavily rely on compassion as their main barometer of how to do things in life, you need to be able to use your own version of pathos to, in my mind, the word comes to mind is kind of manipulate. Manipulate's not the right word. It's more like you're using their already pre-existing hardware of their mind and their actions. You're using that to your advantage. So it's not really manipulating. I think that's just kind of a funny word to me to use, but you're playing the game. You're playing the game of persuasion, and if they're not able to react and understand the whole breadth of everything that goes into life beyond just compassion in this little area of anti-gun sentiment, then you're going to have to come to their table and play their game. So how do you play their game? So what I do is, you want to create some scenarios and ask some hypothetical situations to help get them out of their mind, to get them out of the zone of 100,000 gun deaths a year. 100,000 is a lot of deaths, right? That's something we have to get around. And we'll talk about how to get around that as a statistic, meaning the logical side of it. But that is also a pathos argument, right? It's not just logical. It's not just a fact. It's also 100,000 gun deaths. People don't like people to die. Therefore, it's an emotional appeal as well. You're trying to prevent deaths. People like to prevent deaths because that's compassionate. Compassionate is an emotional appeal. So you're trying to get rid of that. So how do you do that? What I always do is I try to identify a scenario that is more important to them than whatever scenario they're describing. So if they come at you with probably the most classic example is, right now people are really talking a lot about school shootings. And it doesn't matter exactly what it is they're saying. The bottom of the argument is going to say, you should be anti-gun because you want to stop school shootings. That is the bottom of the argument. It's not a logical argument. It's not a this many school shootings occur, therefore this many people die. That is counteracted by logic over here of how many deaths are prevented by guns, etc. It's not a strict utility argument. It's emotional. Think of the children. Don't you want children to not die? Obviously, everyone wants children to be alive. Nobody wants children to die. That's a stupid argument. However, if you're going to persuade somebody, and remember, this is all about persuasion. This is not debate. No matter how much I want to say, that's a stupid argument. That's a stupid reason. Don't think that. That would kill my credibility, right? We already talked about credibility. You need to be respectful. You need to listen. You need to be a responsible, mature person as you're trying to persuade them. So here's how you do it. You want to try to get them away from that issue of compassion that they are attached to. So let's say school shootings. You want to redirect that energy to a scenario in which your group that they might like, I say group meaning, here's the groups that I've identified: kids, women, or their racial or ethnic group. So you want to redirect that energy of, don't you want to save the children, to them saying that, and I say, well, don't you want to save the women? Don't you want to save single women from being sexually assaulted? Don't you want to save whatever racial group from being victimized by some other racial group? Don't you want that? So what you're doing is you're saying, you've got this compassion thing over here, right? Why are you not applying compassion over here to these people? So you're trying to create some cognitive dissonance in your audience. You're trying to say, why is it that you are allowing your compassion to rule the day over here, but you're not allowing compassion for these people over here who you also want to help? Something very common for anytime you're speaking to women, for example, women have a kind of a special spot in their heart for children, typically, especially mothers, and men do too, but women, I think, are especially easily swayed by this kind of emotional appeal. If you want to convince somebody to come over to the self-defense side of the argument, you need to try to come at it in a way that makes sense to them. So if you know that this woman that you're talking to is a mother, this is a classic way to help them understand that compassion is useful, but is not the only thing that matters, and to help them break free of their own chains of thinking that compassion is the only thing that should matter. So if you say something like, Debbie, whatever, Debbie, you're a mother, right? She say, yeah, I'm a mother. And I know that you want to save these kids from school shootings and whatnot, right? Yeah, I do, of course. So you think that getting rid of the guns will stop those things, right? Yes, of course. Well, let me ask you something. Have you ever been at home and not felt safe? Pretty much everybody has felt unsafe at some point in their life. If they're not, then you can move on to some other place. Have you ever gone out in public and not felt safe? Everyone should say yes to that at some point. Well, Debbie, have you ever been outside with your child, your little Susie? You ever been outside with Susie and felt unsafe? Chances are probably yes. Then you say, well, how would you protect your child? Like, how far would you go to protect your child? Let's say somebody ran up and they tried to steal Susie from you. What are you going to do? Well, typically, mothers will respond by saying, they will often respond by powerful reaction. They will say, oh, I'll kill him, I'll rip his throat out, They'll have a very strong reaction to that. As a, maternal instinct, it's easier to be defensive of somebody else in your mind when you're identifying these scenarios. You say, okay, Debbie, so you would protect Susie by any means necessary, lethal force, no holds barred, you'll protect Susie, right? Of course I would do that. Well, why would you use a gun? Would you use a gun to do that? Now, this is where it's going to get a little tough for them, because on the one hand, they've already made the decision to be anti-gun, but on the other side, they have already identified and said, yes, they would kill this hypothetical person who's trying to steal their daughter. Now is going to come the time where this is really where it's going to come, push comes to shove. What do they value? Do they value compassion for those kids, or do they value compassion for their child? And those are really two conflicting things. And actually, they're really not, but in their mind, they can be. If they artificially decide compassion over here for those school children, the school shootings, that's important. It is. But if they can't understand and see compassion for their own children, single women who need to protect themselves, racially targeted groups, let's say, somebody who's the target of racial violence, things like that, where yes, they see this over here because it's very obvious. However, you have shown them another scenario where it's not so obvious. And that's really, I think, the most powerful way to get people to get out of their feedback loop of compassion, mothers against violence, mothers against drunk driving, whatever. Get them out of that so that they can see that the world is bigger than just seeing school shootings. It's not so simple as stop the school shootings by getting rid of the guns. Well, if you get rid of the guns over here and you get rid of guns everywhere, Susie might not make it, because you might not have everything you need, Debbie, to save Susie. Now you're getting into the realm of, now you can persuade them to get on that self-defense argument. Okay, so self-defense is actually personal to me now, meaning Debbie. Debbie sees I could use a gun to protect Susie. That's probably the best way to go about doing it. And it can come about in different ways. I would say, if you're not quite sure how to get to that point, like, I think I've had enough conversations at this point about it that pretty much everybody goes through those same motions. They come at it from some compassion area, and I redirect them to finding some other area where they also have compassion, and now they're put in a quandary. Now they don't know now they are feeling like, okay, well, I feel compassion for both these scenarios, and if all I based it on was compassion, now I have to start thinking about what makes the most sense to satisfy both these scenarios. And that's what you want. That little butting heads of different priorities is really what you're looking for. Just getting that little nudge can really unlodge a lot of people and start people thinking, whoa, yeah, I didn't even think about myself, or I didn't think about, some other person who typically they identify with. Women tend to identify with other women. If you're black, maybe you identify with other people who are black. If you're Mexican, other people who are Mexican, etc. Whatever. Whoever you identify with, then you might be able to get yourself out of this little compassion bubble that they had over there. You also want to be very mindful that when you're making these arguments, you want to get out of any rights-based arguments. So what I mean by that is, a rights-based argument is where you say, this should happen because it's my right. If you don't establish and agree upon what a right is, you're never going to get them to move just based on this thing as a right. It's an appeal to something that you may not have the same background on to agree upon. This is another area, another way you don't want to argue, is you don't want to appeal to authority, meaning like you don't want to say you shouldn't get rid of guns because the Second Amendment says it shall not be infringed. That is an appeal to authority. That is saying you shouldn't get rid of the guns because they wrote a law saying you shouldn't get rid of them. Now, those of us who are in the know that that's really not an accurate representation of that. It's more like there is a natural law that is established of people's rights as sovereign humans, people who are established under God, etc., blah, blah, blah. But the Constitution is a physically written document, and that is the law of our land. So if you're appealing to that as your reason, you're just appealing to an authority. It's the same thing if you appealed to the Bible. If your audience does not subscribe to the Bible as being something that is worthy of listening to, or believing in, or that it's truthful, or whatever, if you say, you should do this because the Bible says so, well, if they don't believe that the Bible is worth listening to, they're not going to do it, and you're not going to convince anybody of that. So I would say stick to self-defense. Self-defense is the unifying force kind of behind the appeal to the authority, the appeal to the Second Amendment. Underneath the Second Amendment is the natural right of self-preservation and self-defense. Those things are the things you want to appeal to. So kind of as a recap, when you're doing pathos arguments, there's ways in which you can weave in both ethos and pathos and logos. So for example, remember how I talked about listening in about ethos? So ethos is established through listening. Pathos is also helped by listening. So if you're somebody who is good at listening and the other person tells you all their stories, their scenarios, they talk about how they feel, and you listen, and I mean really listen, like actively listen, and not just, yeah, cool, oh yeah, my turn? So if you actually listen, you say, okay, yeah, I see, gotcha. So if you actively listen, you are building both your ethos and you're also building pathos in terms of persuasion. You're showing them that I can listen to you and they like being listened to, and that also feeds into the credibility part. But they can also just like you listening to them, and if they feel supported by you, they'll listen to you as well. So these are all things that go into pathos. It's a big topic, but think about finding those scenarios in which you can dispel the myth or the natural inclination that compassion is the thing that you have to go to immediately. Get them to feel compassion about something else that matches what you want to prove later on about self-defense. So that's my strategy. Hopefully it's helpful for you. List down below. Comment anything that you have used as useful ways in which you have gotten somebody to feel pathos, to drive them to taking action about becoming pro-gun. Typically, those people, well, maybe not typically, but oftentimes, people who become pro-gun because of some big event, some traumatic event in their life that they realized that whole notion of feeling compassion for these people over here but not for yourself, that was a bad choice, and they often find themselves without protection for themselves because they thought that making the choice to not protect themselves was somehow virtuous by not investing in things that they can use to protect themselves, i.e. guns, training, security systems, pepper spray, etc. Things that they can use to protect themselves. So I hope this is helpful for you. This is part 2 of at least a 3-part series about ethos, logos, and pathos. Next up is logos. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.